Hey everybody, welcome to a Kiteworks webinar. We are thrilled to have Charles from Mandiant as well as Jeroen, our Chief Product Officer, with us. It's going to be a very, very lively conversation. We will be talking about the anatomy of an MFT breach. There's a lot going on in this arena, particularly this year, but it dates back a couple years actually to the Accellion FTA breach. We're going to talk about what's happened in each of these. We'll try to break it down in terms of how can an MFT actually be hacked and what are the repercussions, what those look like. We'll look at some recommendations and then we'll look at some takeaways. It'll be probably about an hour-long conversation, and I'm looking forward to this. Let me get my slides up here. Need to make sure I have the right window. There we go. I'm going to not run it in presentation mode because of some limitations on the platform here. It'll make for so I can actually see Jeroen and Charles, which makes for a much more lively conversation. As I said, we're thrilled to have Charles from over at Mandiant, who has worked with Kiteworks for the past 2 or 3 years. He's a real partner. Every time we have him come out and present at one of our events, he has a lot of sage advice, a lot of great recommendations. He's a great speaker. He appears regularly on the speaking circuit. And then we have Jeroen Gallant, as I said, our Chief Product Officer from Kiteworks, who was here when the Accellion FTA hack actually happened. He is the architect behind the Kiteworks platform, particularly all the security capabilities that are baked into it. We'll be talking about those later on during the conversation. But before we dive into the details, Charles, why don't you give our audience a short introduction and tell them who you are. Probably most of them already know who you are, but if not, let's get them up to speed.
Great. Well, first of all, Patrick, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. Jeroen, great to see you again. Great to do this with you. So I'm Charles Carmichael. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Mandiant. I've been with the company for 12 years, and I oversee a team of folks that perform incident response work and help organizations both respond to and prepare for security events. And I'm also a business user and a customer of the Kiteworks platform. It's a solution that we use to securely share documents with a number of our clients. So it's good to be here and good to chat with you all.
Yeah, there's a great video of Charles actually on the Kiteworks website if you want to check it out. It's a really good video we shot a year or two ago, right in the middle of COVID. Jeroen, you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. And hello, everyone. And hi, Charles. Always a pleasure. My name is Jeroen Gallant. My beginnings were in the Israeli NSA. I'm one of the as a nation state cyber engineer. It continued to I'm an inventor of the web application security space and the first WAF. Been with Kiteworks for just over 6 years, running product and engineering here as a Chief Product Officer. Again, a pleasure to be with you all here.
When I had a conversation with Jeroen, I guess it's been 6, 7, 8 months ago, and he kind of went through what actually happened with the hack and all the machinations and sophistication that was employed. I found it quite interesting. So this is a nice follow-on conversation. He'll be probably covering some of those same things during today's conversation. Let's go to the next slide. I already pretty much told everybody what we're going to be covering. We're going to talk about the MFT attacks, attack vectors. We'll discuss that the CLOP organization seems to be behind most of these recommendations to companies that have been breached by MFT attacks. Charles has spoken about that already out in the media. We've kind of collapsed some of those into a few slides that I think the audience will find helpful. And then we'll conclude things by covering some takeaways from what actually has happened and where we can go as we move forward. Before we do so, let's talk a little bit about what is managed file transfer. Most of you in the audience probably already know, but just to set the agenda so everyone is on the same playing field as the three of us. I'll go ahead and read this for everyone. Technology used for the digital transfer of data in an automated, reliable, and secure manner internally and with third parties using governance, tracking, and controls for regulatory compliance. Charles, we had an interesting conversation as we were prepping yesterday for the webinar. around, the software supply chain attacks. Does MFT fall into what those are? Is it something different? What thoughts do you have on that front for our audience?
Yeah, so let me start with kind of the common definition of what a supply chain attack is. And if you ask the random person what a supply chain attack was, but you asked them before the SolarWinds event that occurred in December 2020, they'd give you one definition, and they'd give you a totally different definition in January 2021. And so let me just share with you what I am trying to use as a common definition, which I think maybe better articulates and illustrates the problem. So what we call a software supply chain attack is really a situation where a software product is compromised by a threat actor in such a way where malicious code is inserted either into source code that ultimately gets built or a product that ultimately gets built and shipped out to customers. And that's probably the best example of that is the SolarWinds Orion product that was laced with malicious software by a foreign government adversary. And we've seen similar situations over the past few years where other software has been laced with malicious content. So a company called 3CX, which makes digital and software, telephone software, got compromised and was laced with malicious content. There is a trading software from a company called Trading Technologies that was laced with malicious software. So that's what we call a software supply chain attack. What we're dealing with here with all these MFT exploitations and vulnerabilities is, it's in a way you could consider it to be a supply chain attack where maybe a vendor or a service provider runs the technology platform and a number of different customers are impacted from a downstream perspective. But really what we're dealing with here is just the mass exploitation of a zero-day vulnerability in a number of different MFT products. And we'll talk about that in much more detail. But I just wanted to maybe just, kind of clarify that, from our perspective, these MFT breaches, I wouldn't call them a software supply chain attack. I'd call them a mass exploitation event that's occurred that's impacted just a lot of organizations.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's a good way to differentiate it. Is there are some fine lines between the two in terms of how you define it. So that's helpful. Let's go to the next slide here. When we broke it down, this is probably oversimplified, but I thought it would be helpful for our audience to understand, how when MFT solutions are breached, what are some of the main attack vectors? And we broke them down into 3 taxonomies here. First of all, code exploits. And we're talking about SQL injection, remote code execution, cross-site scripting, command injection, et cetera, et cetera. We could actually add some more to this list, but these are the ones that are more prevalent in this case. And then we have system access, credential theft, misconfiguration, which is a big issue. If you read the Verizon report that came out, the data breach investigations report back in June, it continues to be a big problem. Backdoor vulnerabilities, malicious insiders. And then the third category we have here is actually being hacked while the data is being transmitted. It's a DDoS attack. It's a man-in-the-middle attack. It's a protocol exploitation. There's different ways in which cyber criminals can actually attack your MFT solution. And we have 3 slides that we're going to delve into a few details in regards to each of these. This one here looks at the code exploits, right? You have, there on the left-hand side, all the different exploits. You have the descriptions for each one. And then how do you prevent or mitigate? And we had some recommendations here that we put together. Select an MFT provider that has encryption at rest, no admin access to files, secure settings by default, cloud and on-premise, regular and comprehensive penetration testing, bug bounty program, and finally, AI-enabled anomaly detection. And Jeroen's going to talk a bit about that capability that's in the Kiteworks platform today. If it's hosted, the MFT provider needs to include security hardening, intrusion detection, and the WAF with customized rules. We have our WAF expert on the phone, Jeroen. In this case, he'll be able to talk a bit about that. If it's on-premise, MFT must provide security hardening, end-to-end encryption, intrusion detection, and a WAF. A lot of same things, obviously. Charles, let's start with you here. Most of the breaches when it comes to MFT are related, as you noted, mass exploitation or zero-day code exploits. There's been a few instances where that hasn't been the case, but most of them are all zero-day. Why do you believe that's the case? And how in the world are these criminal gangs going and finding these vulnerabilities that no one knew about until they actually found them?
Yeah. So let me take a step back. Mandiant investigates about 1,000 security events every year. And when we look across all the cases that we work on, we often see that threat actors are exploiting vulnerabilities either as a 0-day or an end day, which is what we refer to as vulnerabilities that have patches available but just weren't applied. And so exploitation is a very common way that threat actors get access to victim organizations. When we think about what threat actors' motivations are, there's really maybe two main categories of threat actors, or two main categories of motivations. The first category are those actors that are motivated to make money themselves. And the second category are threat actors that conduct intrusions for governments for purposes that would benefit a government, typically from an economic, military, or political advantage. And so as you think about the MFT mass exploitation events that have occurred over the past few years, those were conducted by a group. There are actually probably a few different groups that were involved in this, but they were financially motivated. The intention was to steal data from organizations so that they could extort those different organizations and, ideally acquire, somewhere between $1 million to say $40 million or so. So it is very clearly done for financial purposes. And when you think about why threat actors choose to exploit particular vulnerabilities, they want to take a path of least resistance. They want to basically do the bare minimum to get access to either systems or to disrupt businesses or disrupt data so that they could extort an organization and apply a lot of pressure. And one of the reasons why MFT solutions have been interesting and popular lately, and by the way, just to be clear, when we just take a step back and we look at all the exploitation that's occurred across all the different technologies, there's been so many different technologies and providers that have had exploitation events, but we just hear a lot about MFT exploitation events because there just happen to be a lot of different victims associated with a few campaigns. And there's three main campaigns that have occurred over the past few years that have gained a lot of publicity and notoriety. But this is interesting to the CLOP threat actor, or who we call Fin11, because what it enabled them to do is it enabled them to steal a lot of data from a lot of different organizations, and in a very short and compressed period of time, extort those organizations and get payment for many of them. And I'll talk a little bit about the successes over maybe the most three prevalent intrusion campaigns related to the Accellion FTA product, the Forger GoAnywhere product, as well as the Progress Software MOVEit product, because there's been varying levels of success that have occurred. But again, the actor is just looking for a very quick way to get paid millions of dollars, and this was just a easy avenue for them to get paid in certain campaigns.
Makes a lot of sense. It's all driven by money in most instances, to your point. And we're going to talk a bit about the MOVEit breach and what happened there. But I read one article this past week when we were preparing for the webinar that projected that they might see up to $100 million in ransom being paid. Now, whether or not that's going to be the case, we'll have to wait and see. And I think, Charles, you're going to talk a bit about how they've gotten out over their skis to the point where they can't scale to meet the extent of what's actually happened with the breach. So, they're maybe leaving money on the table because of some of the things that have happened, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Yaron, yesterday we spoke about this briefly. I'd ask you, do some of these exploits have greater risk than others? And I think your answer was, it kind of depends. Probably not. It just depends on which one provides them with access to the system and the ability to hack into it.
Yeah, it's interesting because together with the same, as Charles was changing his definition of what third-party breach is, I think we also went through. We were also went through the FTA breach, and that changed our perception of reality. We had to change a number of definitions that we had in response to the events. I have to say that personally, my level of appreciation to the capabilities that we're standing in front, that we're facing on the other side of that chessboard, almost dark chessboard on the other side. Those estimations have gone significantly up. The two crowd that Charles mentioned, we're talking about nation states and professional threat actors. These are not, it used to be, there used to be a term called script kiddies that was, worthwhile talking about. This term is not worth talking about anymore because it's not a significant player. Everybody nowadays, so you asked how the 0 day gets attacked. So those organizations stockpile, basically used to stockpile. It used to be mostly nation state, a small number of nation state. They used to stockpile those weapons, the 0 days, unbeknownst to the well ahead of the vendor oftentimes, and just dole them out when they needed, or chain them up in certain ways to create actual P0 level penetration. The stockpilers are ubiquitous now. There's many companies who do that. There's a very active trade of these weapons. They will be sold as a software or as a service. So what happens is, whereas a list like that, and it's obviously it's sub the leaves, was the sort of treasure trove of every nation state that was a significant player. Now they're sitting in a very convenient, commercially available array, if you will. So what happened is the individual attack lost a lot of their cachet because there's many of them. There's many of the others as well, and so on. And now the question is, what do you want to do with it? Can you put a few dollars together to get a professional body to chain these for you? And if you add to these something that services that came about, like Showdown, the services that it can give you access to all the presence, the entire footprint of a certain device on the internet. Basically, what comes out of this is a chaining. So the risk is really now in the chain, and the way to deal with these changed. It's no longer, do I have a cross-site scripting? It's of course I have to ask this question about my product, but I have to look at the whole thing very systemically. Back in the day of the early days of the WAF, when we were, kind of advocating the need, we said, the hacker only needs to be lucky once. You need to be lucky all the time, and that really, is the way. They can be lucky once. They could be lucky once on any one of these, and they still can. And there's to fight with that, you have to assume that they have the worst weapons in their arsenal. When I first looked at the FTA breach, the first impression, I remember it hitting me. I haven't seen it in a good number of years since I've been on that side. I looked at the first indication of compromises, and I was like, yeah, that's a professional. That's it. It's like you immediately, the modeling of that dark image sitting on the other side of the chessboard in front of me immediately took a certain shape, which was, for all intents and purposes, nation state. It wasn't, as Charles said, this was a commercial organization, if you will, but it was absolutely using TTPs that were techniques and tactics that were very much characteristic of a professional organization.
Yeah, those are spot on. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those in detail here in a moment. For sake of time, let's
maybe I'll say another word. As you now are moving through these, and now we see a system access. when a professional organization, the game is no longer, a bragging right or anything like that. It's a serious game. It's a professional game, and we heard about the motivations. The motivations are not ephemeral. They're highly lucrative and highly meaningful to whoever is enacting them. So it's not about breaking into a system. It's about capture the flag. There's a flag. It's in the camp, and when you come from this mindset, it's like an intelligence operation or like a secret, covert operation. You surround you look at the entire footprint, you look for the entire footprint on the cyberspace, on the human space, you will go to individual human beings and fish them or bend them or do all kinds of things, and you'll go to machines and you look eventually at this entire envelope, the entire attack surface, really. That's the first thing, is to uncover the attack surface to its maximum accessible surface areas and look for the weakest link. So if it's easier to get credentials because I, can influence a user or because I can fish a user, let's do this. Let's not try to kind of, break into the software facade, if you will. So the breadth of this in terms of risk is key, and the threat modeling has to assume that this is the modus operandi, and any one of the actors or the types of actors Charles mentioned before is basically an actor capable of getting into any system in existence should they choose to spend enough resource on, which is oftentimes formidable. So the whole security posture needs to be thought through from the perspective they will get in. Yes, I'll do all the traditional thinking, but they will get in, and now what kind of thing? This is a, in a way, and that's part of what happened that kind of revolutionized our thinking, perception of the world, if you will, during the FTA breach. Also, 2020 was a transformative year, I think, in many people's cyber life. Was to assume that it's not about preventing them from getting in. Preventing from getting in is necessary but highly insufficient. So it's about assuming they're going to get in and modeling our whole perception and building a framework to deal with that situation. And there are ways to do it, but you have to ask it like this. It doesn't just come about otherwise.
Yeah. Those are some great points. Charles, when we look at system access, we look at it, the cybersecurity landscape in general, it seems that this maybe is the biggest problem or the most frequently reported issue when something is hacked. It was a system access. It was credentials that were stolen, or malicious insiders did this, that, or the other, or is just accidental misconfiguration that allowed a hacker into the system. The ones we've seen, the three we're looking at, were really related to code exploits, but I assume system access is just as big of a problem. It just so happens that they found other ways in the case of the 3 MFT breaches that we're talking about.
Yeah, look, the 3 MFT breaches got a lot of media attention just because of the large volume of victims. And by the way, look, I'll tell you, as I think back to December 2020, January 2021, when the Accellion FTA event occurred, there was some media coverage that maybe picked up a little bit over time as victims had to disclose that they had a security event. When I look back to earlier this year, the Fortran GoAnywhere situation, that got more media attention because that was the second mass exploitation event that occurred, because people remembered that a few years before there was an event with the Accellion FTA product. And now with MOVEit, because of the number of victims that are there, plus the fact that this had happened a few times before, it got so much media attention. And when I think about what occurred over those three different, mass exploitation events, essentially the threat actor was able to get privileged access to those systems. They were able to deploy code by way of web shells onto those devices. They were able to get access to credentials and log in and download data at scale at a lot of different organizations before the vendors even knew that there was a security vulnerability that was being exploited. But outside of those three main campaigns, we see attacks against MFT products or other applications all the time where there's some level of phishing that's involved, where somebody's credentials are stolen. but they're kind of one-off events. They happen a lot, but they're one-off events. And, I think our perception about MFT attacks is a bit skewed just because of all the news that's occurred over the past few months. And
yeah, that's a good point, and things may calm down. But if there's another one, then there's more to write about because you've already had these others take place, and they're getting worse because CLOP, Fin 11, they're figuring out how to make them more and more successful, I think, and we'll talk a bit about that. The last item here, when data is in transit, when it's being transferred one system to another, there's ways in which it can be exploited. Man-in-the-middle protocol exploitation, DDoS is, obviously an interruption in the actual service. If you are using multi-tenant, then they could attack other tenants and they could shut things down or at least slow it down where the data couldn't be transferred. Yaron, can you speak a bit about this slide and what can happen and what are some of the recommendations that we have over there on the right-hand side of the slide?
Yeah, so in a way, so the DDoS family are less used nowadays just because usually the motivation is to gain something and not so much to disrupt. Sometimes there is that, but you want to gain something. But what this shows you, I would look at this slide in the context of the previous two that basically show you the gamut of the expanse, and it kind of gets me to to what I refer to as how do you build a security posture against somebody with this level of arsenal that can touch machines, that can touch human beings, through machines, and use this completely opportunistically. It just shows you the wide array of what they have at their disposal. So the way, so this is where our past as nation state operators comes very handy for building the defense posture for this. When you think about the defense, which is what's interesting to us, is I want to know the threat actor to the extent I can model that actor and build a defense system, because I'm out to help the industry, if you will. I'm out to help the government. I'm out to help the people with a business problem, which basically is, yes, they live in technology, but their problem is risk mitigation, whether it's for the well-being of a nation or of an organization or of the clients of the organization, all of us included, by the way, which is part of that picture. So when the way this kind of compels me to think is a little bit like the fire triangle. In Fire 101, you learn that you have to have three things for fire. You have to have combustible, you have to have heat, and you have to have oxygen. Take one, the fire loses its momentum. When we look at advanced persistent threat, let's call it in a kind of a bucket those different threat actors under one name, they have a triangle as well. The triangle is you need stealth, you need time, and you need capability. Capabilities they have because they have resource and they build them over years. Time and stealth is what they need to exact there in front of a good system. When their adversary is the more capable their adversary is, the more they need that time. They need to move from one stronghold to another laterally in a system, and so on. This takes time, and as soon as they get flushed out, the game, it's not necessarily game over, but it really hinders their game. And their MO is to operate like any other. They're basically like any other covert intelligence organization. You flush them out, you sort of spoil their party in a very, very substantial way. So, so the question is how to break that triangle of APT fire, if you will. So you need to start taking the sides away, and there needs to be a plan how to take each one of those sides. So stealth and time is where you kind of want to turn the table. The hacker only needs to be lucky once. You want to change it into the hacker only needs to be unlucky once. How do you do that? You make it it all starts on a bedrock of controlling the software that the vendor sells. When you build a software, you want to be able to control it. You want to be able to control what's in there, and you want to be able to control who gets to put things in there. In other words, you want to be that sole function. Why? Because that lets you take that time in stealth. If you have full control over what's inside that box, what we do is you just spread, you do very detailed logging, and you spread a lot of detectors that look at these activities and will trip a alert every time something suspicious happens. So when you look at the MO of the APT today, this is always going to be preceded by reverse engineering of the system. They will always obtain possession of the product or the products or environments. They'll replicate environments. They'll build a whole, build environments and perimeters in-house, and they will practice and learn on these environments. And when they come out, they do it scripted, they do it, well-known, and so on. If you log very carefully and you spread a lot of tripwires in the field inside that box, if you know what's going in the box, you can trigger those or configures those tripwires to be quite sensitive. If nobody's walking around you can tune your seismograph, if you will, to a very sensitive level because you can predict pretty much everything that happens there. And if you can't predict it, you want to know about it, and you want the product itself to alert about it, because it's hard to reach the customer. For the customer to receive an email or to the customer to send you a support email saying, "Hey, I'm seeing something," you're under the risks, if you will, of the internet, of the email system. This communication in and of itself can break in the middle. So you want the product to be very good at logging and very good at anomaly detection inside the product. The finer tuned, the better. That is how you take the stealth and time. You basically want to make sure that whenever it makes, even if they read the code, it's really hard to not miss. The hacker needs to be lucky all the time in order to not trip any one of these. Now, the hardening on the ability side, you can't take away their ability, but you can certainly make it more difficult for them. And you do this with layers upon layers. You basically take all these attacks, and you know that every layer will have some sample of these past three slides, and you build another layer and another layer and another layer, and it's such that they go through the first one. It takes a while to find the P0. Maybe they had one in their coffers, maybe not, but then they meet the next one and the next one. And whenever they get finally to the content needs to be encrypted, and the keys need to be hard to get, and so on and so forth. And what this does, at least what we've seen, for example, with Log4j, we have a whole security posture around building logging and alerting and hardening. And that took Log4j, which a lot of people remember, more vividly than anybody would like. That was a 10.0 CVSS score. We, of course, jumped to the task on the very Friday, the unpleasant Friday they showed up. And for us, it was a 4.3. Without doing anything special to Log4j, exactly because you go from a certain vector and at some point you'll find a roadblock, and you go from a different vector and you find another roadblock, and so on. So these two are very important, looking at systemically, looking at the logging and alerting, and looking at the hardening and its obfuscation and deception and a whole bunch of technology that goes around that. And last but not least, and this is where I first met Charles in this somewhat unhappy situation, you got to bring audit. You got to do your own audit, and you got to bring outside parties to do your own audit, because nobody has, mandate on software bugs effectively. So you got to have talent times time looking at the problem. And when we had the second iteration of the FTA was 2 attacks. The first attack, in a way, they in and of themselves were not aware yet of how valuable the information is. They actually started with sampling. It wasn't, nothing big in the beginning. And then they looked at what they got there and scaled it up. Then came January. And then we did the whole then it became, a chess game, almost to death, because every piece we lose it means pain for a lot of customers, a lot of people. And when we're done with this, we worked with Mandiant hand in hand, and we said, here's what we did. We did this. Here's the code. Here's what we found. Here's what we did. And Mandiant sat on, with this for days, and eventually, gave us feedback to see if we covered everything, or we have it in February, or what have you. This is key. You have to have eyeballs, capable eyeballs, looking at this. We, for example, have two bounty programs, actually 3 bounty programs that do black box penetration in private and public settings. And we also have a white box program that all hire outside people, outside companies, and we cycle through them. Because, every couple of years of one kind of outfit looking at us, we change to a different outfit, even if we're happy with the first one. But, you got to give it all the attacks from all the angles, and you got to do it not just to your product, because if you go back to Charles' the definition of supply chain, it's lacing products with malicious code. For that, some of the tactics or strategies even is to actually not attack the product. It's attack the perimeter, get into the perimeter. From the perimeter, you navigate laterally into the build environment of the product. You breach that environment. And once you own that environment, then you will produce any product to your liking, if you will. And what comes off the production line is really a pristine infected product. So you have to apply it to the product, but you also have to apply it to your process and to your perimeter. So it's a 3x3 kind of framework, and this is really what happens when you look at this plethora of arsenal that you just flashed on the screen in a quite a blood-curdling way, if I may say so.
Thanks, Yaron. We have about 20 minutes left in the webinar. I want to make sure we can make it through all the content. Yaron pretty much talked about what happened with FTA, highly sophisticated. It involved 2 separate zero-day attacks, one in December, one in January. Charles, is this kind of typical where you'll have a multi-prong attack where it's just not once, but they do it multiple times and they exploit different vulnerabilities? Was this unique?
Yeah, look, I think it's happened a few times in the past. It's not that common, but it's definitely happened a few times. But let me share my personal perspective on the Accellion FTA attack. So just going back in time, December 2020, many of you may remember that my organization had just disclosed that we were hacked by a foreign adversary. It was a very humbling experience being a cybersecurity company dealing with our own security event. I think we learned a lot from that process. I think the community learned about that because there was a much broader software supply chain attack that had occurred. But I'll tell you, I was very hypersensitive to having another security event. And roughly around that time, I was getting a lot of calls from folks on my team that were actively investigating intrusions related to our customers' instances of Accellion FTA. And maybe the first, maybe first or second or third time that I heard about a security event related to that, I thought, okay, something seems to be going on. But quite honestly, I was very focused on the security event of my company. And then as I started hearing about maybe the 4th and the 5th customer that was dealing with a security event with their Accellion FTA product, I started getting pretty concerned because my organization is a customer of Accellion. We use the Kiteworks product, not FTA, but the first time I met Yaron and 2 of his colleagues, the CEO and the CISO of the at the time the Accellion organization, I had asked the question, should we be concerned about the product that we're using right now? Because I had actually shut down the tenant that we had set up in our environment because I was concerned about us getting exploited. And after having a conversation with Yaron and Frank and Jonathan about the products, and by the way, the differences in what the Mandiant organization was using versus the instances or the version of the technology that was being actively exploited, I got a certain level of comfort around the instance that we had running, and we turned it back on. But as I kind of took a step back and started more broadly investigating the intrusions at other organizations. We had a lot of experience with the Fin11 group or the Clock group, but this was the first time that we saw them do a mass exploitation event of an MFT product. And I think they were learning as they went along. And by the way, they're still learning today. They're making a lot of mistakes through the process. And I'll talk about, some of the things that they've done well and some of the things they've done wrong. And I want to be cautious because just in case they end up watching this webinar, I don't want to give them any tricks to doing anything better. But I do want to highlight a few things that we observed.
Definitely don't want to do that.
Yeah. So yes, there were two different waves of exploitation against the Accellion FTA product. And there were multiple different security vulnerabilities that were chained together that enabled the attacker to do what they did. Now, one thing we noticed is they were stealing a large volume of data from a number of different organizations. I forget what the exact count was, but let's just say it was roughly around 100 different organizations. A few months passed. We weren't exactly sure what they were going to do with the data. We expected that there would be an extortion event that occurred. What was kind of interesting and maybe ironic about this threat actor was they were emailing a number of different victim organizations saying that, we are the ones that are responsible for the hack against your product or against the Accellion FTA product, and that it was running within the victim's environment. And we stole a lot of data from your organization. And if you don't pay us, $5 million, $10 million, $50 million or so, we're going to publish all the data that we stole. What was ironic is that a lot of those email communications ended up never getting delivered to the victim organization because they were caught by email spam filters. And so a lot of the victims that we ended up working with at the time only learned about a security event and an extortion because they saw their name show up on the threat actor's victim shaming site. Now, they may not have actually found that posting themselves. A journalist may have reached out to them and said, hey, we saw that, the Clock group claims to have hacked into your organization. Do you have a comment about it? So there were a lot of organizations that were caught off guard that didn't know that they were being extorted. The other thing I thought was interesting was some of the extortion demands were astronomically high, higher than I would expect any organization to reasonably consider paying. Some organizations received 50 million, so $50 million demands, which I could understand why the threat actor might think that somebody would pay that, but that was a pretty high demand for the value of the data that they had. And so there were a number of things that the threat actor did or didn't do that essentially made that extortion campaign against FTA customers not that successful. If we could maybe flip to the next slide, I'll talk about the next campaign that they conducted.
Good transition.
Yeah, this was against the Forter GoAnywhere product. So this occurred earlier this year, and I'll tell you, from my vantage point, and I don't want to give the threat actor any credit, but this was a very lucrative extortion campaign for them because there's a few things that occurred that enabled them to get paid more money. So number one, they had the benefit of a lot of people being able to go back in time and look at all the extortion and the shaming that occurred to Accellion FTA victims. So there were a lot of law firms whose information was published on the threat actor's victim shaming site. So this time around, earlier this year, the threat actor was able to say, hey, look what occurred in December 2020 / January 2021 timeframe. We imposed a lot of pain to a lot of victim organizations. And if you don't want that same pain, you need to pay us $5 million or $10 million. And this time around, I found that the extortion demands, they were high, but they were much more within range of what a victim organization may pay. Now, ironically, in this situation or this campaign, the threat actor also struggled to effectively communicate the initial extortion demand to the victims because a lot of times the emails were getting caught by spam filters. So this time around, the threat actor decided to engage a call center to reach out over the telephone to call a number of employees of the organization and say, hey, we've hacked into your organization and we're extorting you. You need to go to this website to communicate with us or email us at this particular email address. And so that's one way that they were able to get in contact with some of their victims. Another interesting event that really changed the dynamic around the extortion payments this time around was that last year, in Australia, there was an organization called Medibank, which is a healthcare insurance provider that lost a lot of very sensitive information about the healthcare insureds, or essentially the people in Australia that hold healthcare insurance through Medibank. And the government told Medibank not to pay the extortion demand. And what ended up happening was the threat actor ended up releasing very sensitive information about sensitive medical procedures that people in Australia had performed. And the people of Australia really revolted, and they said, the harm that is imposed is on us as the people, or as the customers of Medibank, as opposed to Medibank, the organization. And so what that event did was it changed the calculus for a lot of healthcare organizations in the United States, where they decided that they didn't want to be in the same situation as Medibank was in Australia. And so they ended up deciding to pay the extortion demand because they were really concerned about the harm that might be imposed on the customers or the insureds or the patients of these healthcare organizations. And so from a revenue perspective, I'll tell you, I had a lot of clients that unfortunately felt no better option but to pay the threat actor when they were dealing with the Fortran GoAnywhere extortion campaign. Now, maybe if we fast forward or flip to the next slide, I think there's a totally different situation with MOVEit. Now, for those that aren't familiar with the situation, there was initially one SQL injection vulnerability that was exploited that enabled an attacker to get access to a number of MOVEit instances. And in the early days of the attack, we didn't exactly know how many victims there were. Now we know there were hundreds of victim organizations. And the threat actor essentially scripted out a way to mass exploit a vulnerability within the MOVEit product, and then mass download data from the tenants and essentially use that data against the organizations to extort them. And in this situation, the threat actor was completely overwhelmed with the number of victims. And in fact, actually everybody was overwhelmed. Incident response companies were overwhelmed. Victims are overwhelmed doing responses. Law enforcement is overwhelmed because there are just so many victims out here. And so the threat actor had to do a few things in order to effectively communicate with the victims. And so instead of sending emails to a whole bunch of victim organizations, which they did send some emails, they essentially went on their website, on their shaming site, and they said, hey, we're the ones that were behind this attack. If you don't want your data to show up on our website, you should reach out to us. And here's the way to communicate with us. And we thought that was interesting because we've never seen a threat actor do that. But clearly they did that because they couldn't, handle the volume of communication.
They were overwhelmed.
So many victims. And, they did make some telephone calls to certain victim organizations. But essentially, what they ended up starting to do is they started publishing data from victims that they stole data from. And in this situation, yes, some organizations paid, but a lot of organizations chose not to pay. And the reason for that is because there's kind of the strength in numbers situation where, a lot of victim organizations said, well, look, we are one of potentially 100, because people at the time didn't know how many victims there were. But over time, they realized, hey, we are one of 500 or 600 or whatever the number is of victims that are dealing with this event. And it's not going to look as bad for us if our data gets published on the internet. You could dispute that argument if you want, and I'm not saying that it's the right argument or the wrong argument, but I'll tell you, a lot of people chose not to pay because there were so many victims. And again, I'm not going to give the threat actor tips on how to more effectively extort organizations, but I will say that there were some that wanted to pay, but the majority chose not to pay that time around. Yep. The other thing that came out of this event was, as you could see in the list of security vulnerabilities that were identified, the security community did a lot of testing of the product, and Progress Software did a lot of testing of the product, and they found other security vulnerabilities, and they issued patches and they communicated it. And I think they were as open and transparent as they could be, given a pretty tough situation. But it's tough when there are so many different vulnerabilities impacting different endpoints that are essentially of the same vulnerability categories.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, there's certainly been an evolution over the last couple of years in terms of their tactics, and the fact that they were almost too successful in terms of the number of organizations that were hacked, where they couldn't reach out to all of them. They're asking them to contact them. instead. These are from, I have three kind of quick points here, faulty MFT breach assumptions that come from some presentations that Charles has made over the last couple of months. I think are quite interesting, and I'll let Charles speak to each of these briefly. But the first one here: if we patched the day the vulnerability was released, we weren't impacted. What's false about that, Charles?
Yeah, so there are a few events that have occurred over the past few years where a security patch has been released, and maybe organizations are quick to apply the patch, but the reality is there was a mass exploitation event that occurred before a patch was released. And so that, really any organization that ended up using the product needed to do a forensic investigation to determine if their instance was compromised. And then if it was compromised, what's the scope and the extent of the compromise? And so unfortunately, pretty much any organization that used MOVEit that had an instance that was internet accessible really needed to do a forensic investigation to determine if they were compromised. Same thing for customers of the GoAnywhere product. Same thing for organizations that had Microsoft Exchange running on-prem a few years ago with one of the vulnerabilities that was mass exploited. So I found that there were a number of organizations that told me, hey, we patched the day that the patch became available. And I said, well, unfortunately, this was mass exploited in a very opportunistic way a few days before the patch was even available. Not every organization in the world was compromised, but the majority of the organizations that had internet exposed MOVEit instances had some level of mass exploitation that occurred, or at least was attempted to have occurred. All the exploitation wasn't successful, but a lot of the exploitation was.
Interesting. All right, second one here. Our EDR systems detected and quarantined the malware. While the system was exploited, no data was stolen.
Yeah. So I had a lot of clients reach out to me and say they initially assumed that there wasn't any data exposure because the antivirus software or the EDR software that they were running on the system actually caught the web shell. Now, what I think they maybe misunderstood was that the web shell was essentially running for a few days, which allowed the threat actor to actually use the web shell or obtain credentials to access the tenant and then download all the data or as much of the data on the tenant that they possibly could download. And so there actually was impact, and there was a data breach, and there was exposure of data. And yes, the EDR solution did catch the web shells, but it caught it a few days after it was deployed, when the EDR providers ended up pushing out signatures to catch the web shells that were deployed.
Yeah, great. That's a great point. All right, the last one here. Since we don't use the MFT solution, we don't have any exposure.
Yeah, what's interesting about this is that, particularly with MOVEit, and by the way, by no means am I picking on MOVEit. It's just that's the most recent example here. And it's interesting because it's just the volume of customers that they have and the number of compromised tenants that existed. One of the challenges that occurred here is that a lot of the companies that were digging into their exposure were companies that actually hosted their own MFT solution. But what a lot of organizations forget is that there are users or employees of these other organizations that are sending data to their business partners, and they're uploading the data to that business partner's MFT solution. So it's not just an exposure of who is running the MFT solution, it's an exposure of who's sending data to an MFT solution that potentially could have been compromised. And this gets really messy because just the large volume of customers that were actually impacted, you've got a downstream impact where you could have a situation where a organization sends data to another organization using a totally different, a protocol or mechanism, and that other company could host, or, ultimately host that data on an MFT solution, or maybe they send it to another party through an MFT solution. So you may not even realize that your data is sitting on an MFT solution until you actually download the stolen data that the threat actors posted on the internet, and you find your own data there. And we have a lot of organizations that have reached out to us because they say, hey, we do business with company X. We see their data is exposed or it's posted on the threat actor's victim shaming site, can you download all this data and just do a search for any of our data there? And every so often we do find data of our customers that didn't even know could have been exposed through a situation like this.
Yeah, these are three great points, I think, that any company needs to take into account when data is breached and they think they weren't impacted. You need to take a step back and double, triple check that that's the case, right? This slide here, comes from some of your presentations as well, Charles, and then we'll flip it over to Yaron can speak to a couple points on the next slide, and then we're about done here with the webinar. But talk through each of these points and
I'll go through it quickly because I think we covered a lot of this already. So again, for the most recent MFT mass exploitation event, you need to assume that the tenant was compromised. And I think at this point, most people have kind of figured out whether or not they had a compromise or not. And maybe it took them a little bit longer to figure that out. But I think people are in generally good shape right now in terms of knowing whether they had an issue. Obviously, implement the patches or the mitigations that were provided by the vendor, and keeping up to date with all the patches that have been coming out. That gets a little bit tricky, but I think we're in better shape today. It's really important to assess what data was actually stolen and to determine data breach disclosure obligations. And again, I think companies, as it relates to the most recent MFT breach, they're still kind of working through that, but they're in a better place today than they were a few months ago. And then, watch for extortion communications that get stuck in email gateways. Actually, coincidentally, we just saw another round of extortion communications being sent to victim organizations by who we think is probably CLOP/Fin11. We're not 100% sure of that yet. We're still kind of digging into it because, by the way, for every real email that goes out there, there's always some number of fakers out there that are trying to leverage the momentum and the publicity and scam a victim organization. But we think that there is another iteration of communications that are occurring right now. And we know that the threat actor is trying to desperately get paid from more victims.
Yeah. Interesting. And then we have one slide here on the takeaways when we look at these three MFT breaches. Yaron, the CLOP scalability. Charles has spoken to that. They got almost too successful because they couldn't keep up and reach out to everyone. They're asking the breached organizations to contact them. No ransomware is being deployed now in these instances, right? But I think that these last two, particularly the long tail impact, having lived through the FTA breach, that's very, very salient. It takes years and years to get through one of these. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, the bout itself, if you will, with let's take the January breach that we had. That took 81 hours. In 81 hours, the system, there was a patch to the system. It closed all the vulnerabilities that were attacked. It closed a range of additional vulnerabilities that we found and with the help of Mandiant helped uncover. And it scanned all the available logs for the known IOC indications of compromise to make sure that the system, as the holes are being plugged, the inside of the system gets cleaned. It rotated keys. It did all the reconditioning of the system to recover from exactly the comments you quoted before. And which, by the way, has to be part of the fix. Part of the fix itself is it has to include the logic to just clean the internals of whatever system was affected. Otherwise, you just lock them in. So we did all this, and all this took 81 hours, and it took Mandiant another week. They spent a whole week with this. It didn't take them a week. They spent a week on this to scour any other angles, and on the outside, it was 9 days, with the system having been, or 10 days, with the system having been patched already well before. We are still dealing with the long tail because the long tail usually happens in and around courthouses. That's where the class action lawsuits, where various outside parties decide that there's a potential here to for litigation, and those are long drawn, and they stand against the organization for a long time. They cause obviously significant expenditure of money. This, from what we've seen, is by far the biggest ticket item. And in fact, it's not the ransom, it's not even the fines and that we see. It's actually the litigious side of things. And it's not even what you pay for lawsuits or for all kinds of agreements you have around lawsuits. It's first and foremost that you pay for your own defense team. Those defense teams are very expensive, and their payment is guaranteed. You may, end up in an agreement of some number with the outside party, and it takes years to pay. Your own litigator is going to be paid on the month, and so on. And for some organizations that that need to do all kinds of corporate level transactions, a standing evident corporate that has an uncapped action work in progress against them is a very inhibiting factor to do corporate transactions. So this is a very long and arduous and expensive and distracting, if you will, process that can last for years, and does last for years, in fact.
Very, very true. Now, we're out of time, so we're not going to be able to speak to this slide, but I wanted to throw it up. We actually have covered, Yaron spoke to it earlier, as you can see here, 4 recommendations when you're evaluating MFT providers. And what does their software development cycle look like? They have integrated security technologies. They have security layering. Yaron spoke a lot about that. And, 4th, do they have advanced threat detection built into the platform? We have AI anomaly detection and other things that give you a leg up where you can detect it proactively and something's actually happening. So this could be a 2-hour conversation, but out of respect of the time of Charles and Yaron, as well as our audience, we need to close things down. Charles, we really appreciate your time. I know you just got back from a long trip. You're jet lagged, and it's 1 a.m. for Yaron because he's traveling, so I appreciate his time. I look forward to our next Kiteworks webinar. Charles, just briefly, how can organizations get in touch with you and your organization over at Mandiant if they need your assistance?
Yeah, feel free to just go to the Mandiant website, and there's contact information there, but you could reach out at investigations@mandiant.com if you have a security event that you need help with.
Yeah, we highly recommend them having gone through that experience ourselves. So we look forward to our next webinar. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you.